We are building the Sports Heroes project from the Ybyte Python curriculum available at www.ybyte.in. Previously, we saw how we could extract the player information from the tournament data using the unique player set. We went through that quite carefully, basically transitioning between lists, dictionaries, and again a list. So here I have a dictionary which contains information, for example, for Pete Sampras, but obviously that's because I was limiting my winner set to Pete Sampras. We are going to, you know, remove that restriction, in which case we'll run a for loop over the winner set and all the players will be represented. However, clearly I want to append this information, let's say, to my winners info list, which remember is going to be a list of dictionaries. And I'm just going to do that by saying, well, append, for example, player info. Now, clearly, this is, quite logical what we are doing. However, for me to be able to present this nicely to my, let's say, whoever is running the program, I will need to do a little bit more work. In fact, we will need to present this in a nice tabular form inside our analysis.dat. Now, that's exactly what we are going to do in this video. We'll see how we can create a function to, let's say, write this entire list of dictionaries as a table into our analysis.dat. Now, recall, previously we mentioned that we'll use three functions for this purpose: print line, which we already done. We have previously built it. Print, let's say, table, and finally print a set, which we'll look at later. So I'm just going to start with that. I'm just going to say, well, def let's say print, for example, table. And to this table, basically I'm going to pass a list of dictionaries. So I just call it, let's say, table. Now, clearly, this being a list of dictionaries, there are two tasks to be done, kind of like reverse of what we do in CSV read. I'm going to have to first put out all the keys and then all the values. So that will make it kind of nice and tabular. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. In fact, I'm going to just start with, let's say, this. Let's start with this, but go a bit slow. So of course, I need to open the file analysis.dat. Of course, it must be in the mode A because I'm appending to that file. I'm not writing a new one. We already discussed that in the past. Now, having done this, I will first figure out, look, what are the keys that I want to write, that are, let's say, relevant for me. And I can get those keys from just looking at the first item of the list table, because every item is basically a dictionary, identical in the keys. Hence, I can just look at the very first one. So what I do is that I just first find out, let's say, all keys, all keys is, let's say, equal to, say I create a list here, and table, say, for example, 0 dot keys. Now remember, this is basically saying that, look, go to the very first item of that list and find out all the keys using the keys method. We have seen this before, and I'm converting that into a list. So my all keys is a list. I am going to say, well, let me just create a string out of this. Again, a lot of, let's say, data movement, but very logical. So I'm just going to say keys line. Basically, I'm creating one single string that will contain all the keys in the way that I want to. So I just initialize this to an empty string. And thereafter, I just run a for loop. I just go and say, well, for, be very careful with the indentation. I just go and say for key, let's say in all keys. So this runs over the list called all keys. And I just go and append the key to the keys line. I just have to be a little bit careful here, because remember, the table should look neatly formatted. And in fact, it was, because remember, the table should look neatly formatted. So I will just make sure that I add sufficient number of, let's say, spaces to this whole thing. For now, I've decided that all my, let's say, columns will be 20 characters wide, and that's okay for me because, the table and the names are such. You may have to fine tune this, but I just go and say, well, 20 minus length of key times, let's say, a single space. Now this has to be a single space, not an empty space. So basically 20 right now is a magic number, sort of hard coded, but that's okay for now. But if you really want, you can actually have this as an argument as well. So that makes it quite flexible. Again, that's something that you can definitely do. Having done this, outside the for loop, because for loop is just forming that one line, I will just go and say file dot, let's say, write, let's say keys line, and plus, let's say, 1 backslash n. Quite logical. Now, one thing I think I mentioned before, that when I use with, I don't have to explicitly go and close the file. That is taken care of, and that's why this method is quite interesting. So when I run this piece of code, of course, I can look at the winners, let's say info list. Um, that has a list of dictionaries where the dictionary corresponding to each player appears exactly once. So, for example, for Stefan Edberg, Novak Djokovic, for example, Bjorn Borg, and so on and so forth. But as you can see, this is not very easy to read. However, the same thing when I want to make it, let's say, nice and clear, I am going to use this function called print table. For now, obviously, it will print only the keys. So I can just go and say print, for example, table, and pass in this winners, say, info list. And when I do this, if I can look at my analysis.dat, notice it's printing out the keys of this dictionary, which are name, country, times one, and years one, quite neatly. So this is kind of useful for me. I will, build this further, right? Obviously, to build this further, having printed the keys, now next is for me to be able to print all the values. Now, which is again not very hard, because essentially all I have to just do is to look through every dictionary and print out the values. For this purpose, I will need to run a for loop. So again, be careful with the indentations. This for loop must be indented with respect to the with statement, because you're still writing into the file. So I just come and say, well, for, let's say, data in, say, table. So data becomes my variable. Data is going to be dictionaries once again. Each data is a dictionary. I follow the same approach as earlier. I just call it, let's say, values line. So create a string which is empty to start with, and for every dictionary, let's say, populate the string and then write it into the file. So that's the approach we are taking. Previously, we were doing it for the keys. Now I will do the same thing for the values. So I just go and say for values, let's say in data dot values. So remember, basically I'm just saying that, look, get the not the keys but the values. In fact, having done this, I will just update the values line to be, let's say, values line plus, let's say, str values. So it's just going through every value in there. And again, as before, I'll give myself, let's say, some spaces. So I just do the same thing. 20 is just a number, but sort of I've hard coded it for now. So str and let's say values. Now, having formed, let's say, the values line, I must write this into the, into the file, but I have to be a little bit careful that this, so I'm going to use a statement similar to this. However, the indentation is very important. I can easily make a mistake here. Remember, I need to write one line per player, which means that this writing has to happen inside this for loop. And that's why it has to be the same level as, let's say, the inner for loop, indented with respect to the outer for loop. I'm just going to say, well, inside this, please write, let's say, values line and give, let's say, one, a backslash n. Now with this done, when I run my code, this time around, when I print, let's say, winners info list, if I look at my analysis.dat, it looks pretty cool. It's come out quite nicely. Um, in fact, you see, it gives a lot more information. So it tells me, well, Ivanisevic, for example, won it once in 2001. Jimmy Connors once twice in, let's say, these years, and so on and so forth. Now, this was obviously present in that, that list that we started with, but not in this format that we readily understand what's going on. Obviously, a lot more things can be done, because, for example, you might want to say that, look, I'm going to present this in a way where, let's say the highest number of winners is put first. So, for example, I want to put Roger Federer on top, Pete Sampras, and so on in, let's say, descending order, or let's say ascending order. Another way to do this is that I'm going to say, okay, look, I'm going to put this in an alphabetical order. So there are many ways you can, present this data. Obviously, all those are bonus ideas, but the basic structure remains the same. The idea really is that we have a list of dictionaries. From that, I go and read data in the way I want to and present it in a way that is, let's say, understandable, readable. I hope this has become clear. In general, if you think this way of learning, where we are building activities to understand stuff, resonates with you, look at our website www.ybyte.in, because that is how we learn Python programming. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.